In our second unit that covers the skeletal system, we'll be talking about how it's organized, and that includes both the names of all of the bones as well as the names of different joint structures and the ranges of motion that those joint structures are capable of. In the Bone.5 video, we'll only be focusing on the axial skeleton. The standard reads, I can identify the bones of the axial skeleton, including the parts of the skull, vertebral column, and thoracic cage. These bones are covered in sections 7.4 to 7.7 of your textbook. All right, our brand new heading for today, Unit 5, the skeletal system, but this time, organization. You do not need to draw this skeleton you see right there. We will draw the bones more individually. So first of all, what is the axial skeleton? It includes any of the bones that are holding up the axial portion of the body. So of course that means all the bones of our skull, our spinal column, and then our thoracic cage, so our ribs, etc. It does not include any of the bones that make up our appendicular skeleton, which would be the bones of our shoulders, our hips, our legs, our arms, hands, feet, etc. Okay, first subheading, bones of the skull. This is a picture I would draw and color code in your notes. So pause the video, get some colored pencils, and do your best. I made sure that I color coded the terms, and if I don't list the term or discuss it, you're not responsible for it. So for example, the external acoustic meatus. That is not something that I am going to test you on. I think that's beyond the scope of a high school anatomy course. So we have the frontal bone, making up what we sort of colloquially know as the forehead. There's just one big bone there. We have two parietal bones. So these are big, broad, flat bones on either side in the middle of our skull. They border a lot of other bones, and you have both a left and a right parietal. So this would be this individual's right parietal bone. In the back, we have one occipital bone. Sort of in the back of our head, it sticks out a little bit. And again, there's only one, just like the frontal bone. We have one sphenoid bone. And so that is right here. And it does appear on two different sides, but it's one bone. Pictured here in pink, kind of behind your eye socket, more or less the temples of your skull. Your cheekbones are known as zygomatic bones. You have one nasal bone, and there's two sides to it. Also notice here that you don't have the beak-like portion of the nose. That's because this was cartilage. This was hyaline cartilage. We are only focusing on bones in this unit, so the nasal bone is the bridge of your nose. You also have the maxilla, which is the upper jawbone, and the mandible, which is the lower mobile jawbone. Both of these have teeth associated with them. I might have left out, but the temporal bone right here in red is also one you need to know. Not the individual parts of it, but it is right on either side of your head, located laterally, and it borders the occipital, parietal, and sphenoid bones. Aside from bones, your skull has to grow together and form joints called sutures. And there's four major sutures I'd like you to know. We'll define them based on which bones they separate. So the coronal suture runs in the coronal plane, which would lead me to believe it's right here, and it is. So this separates the frontal bone from both the left and right parietal bones. It goes down the right and left hand side. The sagittal suture runs in a sagittal plane, so front to back. It can't be seen at this view. We'd have to see it from the top to see the sagittal suture, but that is going to run between the left and right parietal bones. The squamous suture runs between the parietal and the temporal bone, so that's over on the side, the most lateral suture. And then lastly, the lambdoid suture separates the occipital bone from the parietal. So all four of these border the parietal bone, so we have sagittal, coronal, squamous, lambdoid, if you need that as a point of reference. But again, this is because when you're born, the flat bones of your skull are not fused together because our brains are just too big and our skulls would not fit through the birth canal if they were fused. So they come out loose and then eventually they grow into one another and form the sutures we see here. All right, aside from the skull, the axial skeleton includes also the vertebral column, so your spinal column. There are a lot of different vertebrae here, and in between every single one in white is a little cartilaginous disc. It is made of that shock absorbing fibrocartilage, and it allows you to have a little range of motion, but mostly it acts as a shock absorber. You have the same number of vertebrae in every region that other humans do. You have 7 cervical vertebrae, which is the most superior region, and these tend to be thinner. They have really obvious spiny processes coming out the back. If we're looking at a person, this would be the head, and so this would be the anterior side, and all of this would be the posterior side. So we see a cervical curvature that goes forward a little bit for about 7 vertebrae. The first 2 vertebrae have their own names because they're extremely important. The atlas is a really long, thin one that supports the head, and the axis goes right through that bone and allows us to pivot our head. We're going to look at these 2 bones in the lab. We have models of them, but the C1 and C2 vertebrae are the atlas and axis. After that, if we're moving inferiorly, you have 12 thoracic vertebrae, and that curve goes posterior. So we had an anterior cervical curve, we have a posterior thoracic curve. 12 of those vertebrae, each is attached to a rib. So we have 12 pairs of ribs then. We have 5 lumbar vertebrae, which are much thicker than the other ones. The cervical were thin, the thoracic were average. The lumbar vertebrae support a lot of body weight, and so they have to be large and load-bearing, and there's only 5 of them. Down below, we have 5 fused sacral vertebrae. So you can see little holes in here. That's because these used to be independent vertebrae in our ancestors, and they have since fused in humans to form one solid bone down there. And so it's called the sacrum, but it's made of 5 vertebrae. And then down at the very bottom, we have 4 more that are coccygeal vertebrae to form a singular bone known as the coccyx. This is your tailbone. Not so much the sacrum, it's the coccyx that forms your tailbone. The last piece of the axial skeleton that we're going to cover is the thoracic cage. That includes ribs, your thoracic vertebrae, your breastbone or your sternum, and then the little costal cartilages that connect the ribs to the breastbone. You have 12 total pairs of ribs, so I guess you really have 24 total. The first 7 pairs are known as true ribs because they attach directly to your sternum. Sternum being this big flat bone here. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. They all attach right to it. After that, the other 5 pairs are known as false ribs because they either attach to other cartilages, like this rib here, or they're just out floating. The last 2 ribs do not have costal cartilage at all, and they're known as floating ribs. Your breastbone or your sternum is divided into 3 parts. The manubrium is this most superior portion that looks like a sesamoid bone, kind of. Then you have a long body. And then down at the very tip, you have what's known as the xiphoid process, a very small bone on the inferior portion of your sternum. Your case study for this particular unit is craniosynostosis, and for that you'll have to have a working knowledge of the flat bones of the skull as well as the sutures that bind them.